The winter wind howled through the shattered roof as Evelyn pressed her trembling hand against the frozen ground. Her 3 children huddled behind her in the darkness, their breath forming clouds of desperation in the bitter cold. 12 days ago, she had buried her husband beneath West Virginia soil. Now, surrounded by rotting wood and broken promises, she clawed at the dirt floor with bleeding fingers, searching for anything that might save them from this nightmare. Her fingernails scraped against something hard, something buried, something that had been waiting decades for someone desperate enough to find it. The rain fell like judgment upon the cemetery at Blackwood Hollow. Evelyn Harper Whitmore stood motionless before the freshly turned earth, her black dress clinging to her frame like a second skin of grief. The casket had descended into darkness 20 minutes earlier, carrying with it the body of Caleb Whitmore, husband, father, and one of 17 men who never emerged from the Raven Creek mine collapse. Around her, the crowd thinned with practiced efficiency. Neighbors offered hollow condolences before hurrying toward their warm vehicles. Coal dust still stained the fingernails of the men who had worked alongside Caleb, and their eyes held that haunted look of survivors, grateful and guilty in equal measure. Behind Evelyn, her 3 children formed a small constellation of devastation. Noah, 13 years old with his father's square jaw and serious eyes, stood rigid as a soldier. His hand rested protectively on the shoulder of 9-year-old Iris, whose face remained buried in her brother's coat. 6-year-old Luke clutched a toy truck, the last gift his father had given him, and stared at the mud pooling around his worn shoes with an expression far too old for his young face. Before we continue this emotional journey, we'd love to invite you to subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you powerful, moving stories like Evelyn's. Your support means everything. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. The Whitmore family occupied the far side of the cemetery, a section reserved for those with money and influence in these mountain towns. Evelyn had married into that name, but she had never belonged to it. Caleb's brothers, Marcus and Stephen, stood beneath a black umbrella with their wives, their faces carved from the same cold stone as the family headstones surrounding them. They had spoken perhaps 10 words to Evelyn since the accident. As the final mourners departed, Marcus approached. His expensive suit remained impossibly dry despite the downpour, as if even the rain knew to keep its distance. Stephen followed 2 steps behind, his expression unreadable. "Evelyn," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from owning half the businesses in 3 counties. "We need to discuss the estate." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Can this wait?" "No." The single word fell between them like an axe. Caleb left debts. The house in town, it was mortgaged beyond its value. There's nothing left. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. "Nothing?" Stephen pulled an envelope from his coat pocket, already dampened at the edges. "There is one property, a cabin. It belonged to the family generations back. It's yours now." Evelyn's trembling fingers accepted the envelope. Inside, a single key and a hand-drawn map, marked with an X, deep in the Appalachian wilderness. No address, no photographs. "Where is it?" "North of here, 3 hours up the mountain roads." Marcus's lips formed something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's been abandoned for decades, but it's shelter, more than some have." The casual cruelty in his tone made her stomach turn. These men had sat at her table, had held her children, had called Caleb brother. Now they looked at her as if she were an inconvenient problem finally solved. "The funeral expenses?" she managed to ask. "Covered by the mining company settlement. You'll receive a small death benefit, enough for a few months if you're careful." Stephen glanced at his watch. "We've arranged for your belongings to be moved out of the house by Friday. The bank requires possession." 5 days. They were giving her 5 days to disappear from the life she had built. Noah stepped forward, his young face twisted with an anger that frightened Evelyn. "You're throwing us out?" Marcus didn't even look at the boy. "Your father made poor financial decisions. We're helping your mother more than obligation requires." The words hung in the wet air like poison. Evelyn felt Iris's small hand slip into hers, felt Luke press against her leg. The weight of their dependence threatened to crush her completely. "Thank you," she heard herself say. though the words tasted like ash. "We'll manage." The brothers turned and walked away without another word, their shadows stretching long across the graves. Within moments the cemetery stood empty, except for Evelyn and her children, the rain drumming steadily against Caleb's grave marker. That night, in the cramped motel room that smelled of mildew and other people's despair, Evelyn spread the map across the stained bedspread. Her sewing kit lay open beside her, the only tools of her trade she had managed to pack. Freelance work and occasional elderly care had supplemented Caleb's mining income, but it had never been enough to save. It had only ever been enough to survive. Noah sat at the table, his jaw clenched in that way that made him look heartbreakingly like his father. Iris curled into the corner of one bed, her eyes red and hollow. Luke had finally fallen asleep, his small body twitching with dreams Evelyn prayed weren't nightmares. "Mom." Noah's voice cracked on the single syllable. "What are we going to do?" Evelyn stared at the X on the map, at the hand-drawn mountains and the single word written in faded ink. Whitmore Hollow. A cabin abandoned for decades. No electricity, probably no running water. Winter settling into the mountains with teeth of ice and wind. She folded the map with steady hands, though everything inside her screamed. "We're going to survive, Noah, whatever it takes." But as she lay awake that night, listening to her children breathe, listening to the trucks rumble past on the highway outside, she wondered if survival was even possible anymore. The key to the mountain cabin weighed nothing in her pocket, yet it felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried. What waited for them in those forgotten mountains, and what had the Whitmore family hidden there so many years ago? The mountain road ended where civilization gave up. Evelyn gripped the steering wheel of their 15-year-old sedan as it lurched over frozen ruts and hidden stones, the engine groaning with each tortured mile. The map led them deeper into wilderness that seemed to swallow light itself. Towering pines pressed close on both sides, their branches heavy with old snow that blocked out the afternoon sun. "I can't see anything," Iris whispered from the back seat, her voice small and frightened. Noah sat in the passenger seat, his jaw set firm, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the door handle. Luke hadn't spoken since they left the motel that morning, his toy truck clutched against his chest like a talisman against the unknown. The cabin appeared suddenly, emerging from the tree line like something from a nightmare. Evelyn's foot found the brake, and the car shuddered to a stop. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. They simply stared at what the Whitmore family had deemed their inheritance. The structure leaned slightly to the left, as if the mountain itself were trying to push it over. Grey wood, weathered to the color of old bones, formed walls pierced by gaps wide enough to see through. The roof sagged in the middle, several shingles missing entirely, revealing dark holes that promised rain and cold and misery. A single window remained intact. The others were boarded over with planks that had rotted to lace. "This can't be it," Noah said, but his voice carried no conviction. Evelyn forced herself to open the car door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, the kind of December cold that existed only in these high elevations, where winter arrived early and stayed late. Her breath formed white clouds as she approached the cabin, her boots crunching through ice-crusted snow. The door hung on one hinge. She pushed it open, and the smell hit her first. Decades of abandonment, animal droppings, rotted wood, and something deeper that might have been despair itself. Inside, the floor was bare earth, frozen hard as concrete. No furniture, no stove. A fireplace filled with debris and dead leaves occupied one wall, its chimney likely blocked by bird nests and time. Iris appeared at her side, her small hand finding Evelyn's. "Mama, we can't live here." The truth of those words settled into Evelyn's chest like a stone. They couldn't live here, but they also had nowhere else to go. The death benefit check, $3,200, represented every resource they possessed. It had to cover food, fuel, and survival until she could find work. There was no money for rent, no money for deposits or first and last month's payments. "We'll make it work," Evelyn said, forcing strength into her voice that she didn't feel. "Just for a little while, until I can save enough for something better." But even as she spoke, she saw Noah's expression, that terrible adult understanding in a child's eyes. He knew, as she knew, that escape from this place was a fantasy. They were trapped. The family spent the remaining daylight hours trying to make the cabin habitable. Noah and Evelyn stuffed gaps in the walls with old newspapers from the car and torn pieces of cardboard boxes. Iris swept the floor with a broken branch, her face streaked with dirt and tears she tried to hide. Luke sat in the corner, silent and still, watching everything with eyes that seemed to see too much. As darkness fell, Evelyn managed to light a small fire using dry wood from inside the cabin, pieces of what might have once been furniture. The flames provided a circle of warmth that extended perhaps 3 feet. Beyond that, the cold waited like a living thing. They ate cold soup from cans, sharing 2 spoons between them. The wind picked up as night deepened, howling through the gaps in the walls with sounds that mimicked human voices. Iris pressed close to her mother, whispering prayers their grandmother had taught her, prayers that felt hollow in this forsaken place. "Everyone try to sleep," Evelyn said, though she knew sleep would be nearly impossible. They huddled together on the frozen ground, wrapped in every blanket and jacket they owned, their bodies seeking warmth from each other. Around midnight, the storm arrived. It came with a violence that shook the cabin's frame, wind screaming through every crack and gap. Then the rain began, not the gentle rain of spring, but freezing sheets driven horizontal by the gale. Water poured through the holes in the roof, turning the dirt floor to mud within minutes. "Mom!" Noah shouted over the storm's roar. "We have to move!" But there was nowhere to move. Every corner flooded. The fire hissed and died, plunging them into complete darkness. Evelyn gathered her children against the one semi-dry wall, using her own body as a shield against the water streaming down from above. Luke's teeth chattered so hard she feared they would crack. Iris sobbed openly now. Noah tried to be strong, but she felt him shaking, from cold or fear or both. "This is how we die," Evelyn thought with terrible clarity. Not quickly like Caleb in the mine collapse, but slowly, freezing in this abandoned place while the world outside continues as if we never existed. The thought filled her with a rage so pure it burned hotter than any fire. She refused. She refused to let her children die in this cabin of cruelty and broken promises. If the Whitmore family wanted them to disappear, she would prove them wrong with every breath in her body. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice cutting through the storm. She crawled through the mud toward the worst of the flooding, where water pooled deepest near the center of the cabin. If she could dig a channel to drain it toward the door, maybe they could salvage some dry ground. Her hands plunged into the freezing mud, scooping, pushing, desperate. The earth resisted, frozen beneath the surface mud. She dug harder, nails breaking, fingers going numb. Water soaked through her coat, her dress, finding skin that had no warmth left to give. But she kept digging because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant death. Her hand struck something solid, not stone, something that yielded slightly under pressure, something wrapped in fabric. Evelyn's heart hammered as her frozen fingers traced the object's edges. Rectangular, about the size of a large book, buried deliberately beneath the floor, hidden for reasons she couldn't begin to imagine. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the cabin for one brilliant instant. In that flash she saw her children watching her with wide eyes. She saw the object partially unearthed in the mud before her. She saw the truth of their situation, balanced on the knife's edge between survival and oblivion. What had been buried here in the darkness, waiting all these years to be found? Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountains. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt oppressive. Evelyn hadn't slept. She sat in the pale morning light, her mud-caked hands cradling the object she had unearthed, still wrapped in thick, oiled cloth that had somehow survived decades underground. Her children slept fitfully against the wall, exhausted beyond the point where cold could keep them awake. Their faces looked thinner already, hollowed by hunger and fear that no child should know. Noah's arm was thrown protectively over his siblings even in sleep, and the sight of it nearly broke what remained of Evelyn's heart. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the cloth. Layer after layer peeled away, each one revealing the careful intention of whoever had hidden this. Finally, the last fold fell open, and Evelyn found herself staring at a Bible. The leather cover was dark with age, cracked along the spine, but remarkably preserved. Gold lettering, faded but still legible, adorned the front, Holy Bible. And beneath it, in elegant script, Margaret Whitmore Hale, 1889 Evelyn's breath caught. Margaret Whitmore, a name she had heard only once, whispered at a family gathering she hadn't been meant to attend. Caleb's great-great-grandmother, a woman who had supposedly disappeared from family records under mysterious circumstances. She opened the Bible carefully, afraid the pages might crumble at her touch. They held firm, though yellowed and brittle. The inside cover bore an inscription in flowing handwriting. To those who come after, when darkness seems complete, the Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Trust when trust seems foolish. Hope when hope seems lost. This place was meant for new beginnings, not endings. Evelyn's vision blurred with tears. She had been too numb to cry during the endless night. Her fingers traced the words, feeling the indentations where the pen had pressed deep into the paper, written with urgency, with intention, with a desperate need to be heard across time. She turned the pages slowly. Many were marked with underlined passages and handwritten notes in the margins. One page fell open as if the Bible itself wanted her to read it. Psalm 147:3, underlined so heavily the pen had nearly torn through. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. In the margin beside it, Margaret had written, "Found me in this very cabin, broken and abandoned. He can find you too. Trust." The words struck Evelyn like a physical blow. Margaret had been here, in this same cabin, facing her own darkness. The Whitmore family had cast her out too, buried her story along with her Bible, tried to erase her from existence. But she had survived. She had hidden this message, this proof, this lifeline for someone who would need it as desperately as she once had. "Mom!" Noah's voice was rough with sleep and cold. "What is that?" Evelyn looked up at her son, at this boy becoming a man too quickly, and felt something shift deep in her chest. "It's a sign," she said quietly, "that we're not the first to suffer here, and we won't be the last to survive." If this story is touching your heart, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful true stories of survival and faith. Hit that subscribe button. It means more than you know. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, sending a shaft of light through the broken roof. It illuminated the Bible in Evelyn's hands, and for the first time since Caleb's death, she felt something other than despair. Not hope exactly. Hope seemed too fragile, too dangerous to hold, but perhaps possibility. She closed her eyes and did something she hadn't done since standing at her husband's graveside. She prayed. Not the formal prayers of church services or the rote words of bedtime rituals. She prayed with raw honesty, with anger and fear and desperate need. She prayed for her children, for strength, for a way forward that she couldn't yet see. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening, but who Margaret Whitmore Hale had insisted was there in the darkness. "Please," she whispered, "if you're real, if you're listening, show me how to save them." The answer came not in thunder or miracles, but in the simple act of her children waking. Iris stirred first, her eyes finding her mother's face and softening with relief that she was still there. Luke uncurled from Noah's protective embrace, his small voice asking if there was breakfast. Noah sat up, his gaze falling on the Bible, curiosity replacing the despair that had lived in his eyes. They were alive. They had survived the night. In this moment, that was enough. Evelyn heated the last of their canned food over a fire rebuilt with difficulty, the wood damp from the storm. As they ate, she told them about Margaret, about the Bible, about the words written across a century to reach them. She watched understanding dawn in Noah's face, watched Iris's expression shift from fear to something that might become courage. After breakfast, Evelyn ventured outside to assess the damage and search for dry firewood. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense and silent, the kind of wilderness that could swallow a person without trace. She had walked perhaps 50 yards when she heard it, footsteps crunching through snow. Her heart hammered as a figure emerged from between the trees, a man, tall and weathered, with a thick grey beard and eyes that held the kind of calm that came from decades in these mountains. He carried a large pack on his back and a walking stick in his hand, moving with the steady confidence of someone who belonged to this wilderness. He stopped when he saw her, taking in her mud-stained clothes, her exhausted face, the desperation she couldn't hide. "You're at the old Whitmore place," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "Didn't think anyone lived there anymore." "We don't live here," Evelyn said, then corrected herself. "We do now, we just arrived." The man's eyes narrowed, but not with suspicion, with understanding that felt uncomfortably perceptive. "Name's Elias Crowley. I walked these mountains, have for 30 years since I left the logging camps. You and yours look like you could use some help." Pride warred with need in Evelyn's chest. Pride lost. "We could," she admitted. "We have almost nothing." Elias nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. He swung the pack off his shoulders and pulled out packages wrapped in brown paper. "Smoked venison, some cornmeal. It's not much, but it's yours." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks before she could stop them. "I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to." Elias handed her the food, his weathered hands steady. "There's a small town about 8 miles east, Hollow Creek. General store, church, couple hundred people. They're good folks when times are hard. You tell them Elias sent you, they'll help how they can." "Why?" The question escaped before Evelyn could stop it. "Why help us?" Elias's expression softened. "Because 30 years ago someone helped me when I had nothing. Because that's what people do in these mountains. We survive together, or we don't survive at all." He shouldered his pack again. "I'll pass back through in a few days. Make sure you're still standing." He turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the trees as silently as he'd appeared. Evelyn stood holding the food, feeling the weight of unexpected kindness, and understood something fundamental. Margaret's message had been right. Trust when trust seemed foolish. Help came from unexpected places. That night, with venison cooking over the fire and her children's bellies fuller than they'd been in days, Evelyn placed Margaret's Bible in the center of their makeshift sleeping area. The book seemed to glow in the firelight, a testament to survival, to faith tested and proven. But survival was only the beginning, and the mountain held more secrets than just a buried Bible. 3 weeks into their mountain exile, Evelyn had learned to measure time not in days, but in small victories. A fire that lasted through the night. A meal that filled all 3 children's stomachs. An hour without teeth chattering from cold. These fragments of survival formed the mosaic of their new existence, each piece hard-won and precious. The morning arrived bitter and clear, the kind of January cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made every movement painful. Evelyn knelt outside the cabin, her raw hands struggling to arrange damp kindling into something that might burn. The wood was never dry enough in winter. Everything in these mountains held moisture like a curse. Noah had walked to Hollow Creek before dawn to ask about work at the general store. Iris and Luke remained inside, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their pale faces watching her through the gap in the doorway. Her fingers, cracked and bleeding from constant exposure, fumbled with the matches. One broke, another refused to light. The third caught, flared and died before touching the kindling. Despair rose in her throat like bile. Something as simple as fire, the most basic element of survival, and she couldn't even manage that. "Need some help with that?" Evelyn's head snapped up. A man stood at the tree line, camera hanging from his neck, watching her with an expression that held both curiosity and concern. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair touched with grey at the temples and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He wore proper winter gear, the kind that marked him as an outsider to these mountains, someone just passing through. "I'm fine," Evelyn said automatically, though everything about her situation screamed otherwise. The man stepped closer, his boots crunching through frozen snow. "Lucas Cole," he introduced himself. "I'm a documentary photographer. I've been traveling through Appalachia, capturing stories of the people who live here. He gestured toward the cabin, his expression carefully neutral. This is your home? The question carried no judgment, but Evelyn felt shame burn through her anyway. It's where we live, she said, the distinction important somehow. Lucas nodded slowly. May I? He indicated the kindling, and when Evelyn didn't protest, he knelt beside her. His movements were practiced, efficient, rearranging the wood to allow airflow, using the driest pieces as a base, creating a structure that would catch and hold flame. He struck a match, cupped it against the wind, and coaxed the fire to life with the patience of someone who understood the temperament of wild things. Smoke rose, then flames. Heat bloomed in the frigid air. Evelyn watched with a mixture of gratitude and resentment, grateful for the fire, resentful that she needed this stranger's help to achieve what should have been within her own capability. Thank you, she managed. Lucas sat back on his heels, his photographer's eyes taking in details she wished he wouldn't see. Her threadbare coat, her broken fingernails, the hollows beneath her cheekbones that spoke of too many meals skipped so her children could eat. How long have you been here? 3 weeks. The words felt like a confession. My husband died in a mine collapse. His family gave us this cabin. Understanding flickered across Lucas's face, and with it, something that looked like anger on her behalf. They gave you this. It wasn't a question, but Evelyn answered anyway. They said it was more than some have. It's an insult. Lucas's voice was quiet but fierce. It's abandonment dressed up as charity. The validation of what she had felt but been too beaten down to name brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. She blinked them back furiously, feeding small sticks to the growing fire. Lucas was silent for a moment, then asked, May I take your photograph? Not for exploitation, for witness. Sometimes people need to see the truth of what's happening in places they've forgotten. Every instinct screamed no. To be photographed like this, at her lowest point, to have her family's suffering documented and displayed, it felt like a final surrender of dignity. But dignity didn't keep children warm or fed. Dignity didn't change circumstances. Will it help? She asked. I don't know, Lucas said, and she appreciated his honesty. But silence never does. Evelyn looked at the fire at the cabin behind her, at the impossible situation that had become her life. Then she nodded. Lucas raised his camera. The shutter clicked once, twice, 3 times. He photographed her hands, cracked and bleeding, feeding wood to the flames. He photographed the cabin with its collapsing roof and broken windows. He photographed Iris and Luke, peering out from the doorway, their faces smudges of pale uncertainty in the darkness beyond. When he finished, he showed her the images on his camera's small screen. Evelyn barely recognized herself, a woman carved from exhaustion and determination in equal measure, surrounded by the evidence of systemic cruelty. The photograph told a story more powerful than any words could convey. I'm going to share these, Lucas said, on my website, on social media platforms, anywhere people might see. I'm going to tell your story, not as tragedy porn, but as testimony to what happens when we abandon our neighbors. He pulled a card from his pocket, pressed it into her hand. My contact information. If you need anything, or if sharing these causes problems, you call me, understood? Evelyn clutched the card, nodding mutely. Lucas stood, brushing snow from his knees. There's a carpenter I know, Hank Morrison. He does volunteer work sometimes, building and repair. I'm going to send him your way if he's willing. No promises, but... He looked at the cabin again, his jaw tight. You deserve better than this. Your children deserve better. After he left, Evelyn sat by the fire until Noah returned with news that the general store might have sewing work for her. Mending and alterations for the townspeople. Small money, but money nonetheless. She told him about Lucas, about the photographs, though she couldn't explain the strange mixture of hope and dread they inspired. That evening, 800 miles away in cities and suburbs across America, Lucas uploaded the images. He wrote about Evelyn, about the Whitmore family's cruelty, about a system that crushed the vulnerable and called it justice. He wrote with the kind of controlled fury that demanded attention. The response began within hours. Comments flooded in. Outrage, sympathy, offers of help. People shared the images and they spread like wildfire through social networks, each share carrying Evelyn's story further into a world that had forgotten people like her existed. By midnight, Lucas's website had crashed from traffic. By morning, news outlets were requesting interviews. A GoFundMe page appeared, created by someone Evelyn would never meet, and donations began to accumulate, $10, $20, $50, $100, each one a small act of collective conscience awakening. And in Hollow Creek, a grizzled carpenter named Hank Morrison, 59 years old with hands as strong as oak and a heart that couldn't ignore suffering, loaded his truck with tools and materials. He had seen Lucas's photographs, he had read Evelyn's story, and he had made a decision that would change everything. The world was watching now, but attention brought its own complications and its own dangers. Within 2 weeks of Lucas's photographs going viral, the cabin transformed. Hank Morrison arrived with a crew of volunteers, carpenters, electricians, and contractors who took vacation days to work in the freezing mountains. They replaced the roof, sealed the walls, installed a wood stove that radiated blessed heat, and repaired windows that had been broken for decades. The GoFundMe page swelled past $30,000, and donations of clothes, food, and supplies arrived at the Hollow Creek General Store addressed simply to the Whitmore family. Evelyn wept the first night they slept in true warmth, her children's faces peaceful in ways she had feared she might never see again. Strangers from across the country had reached out across the distance of their comfortable lives and pulled her family back from the edge of oblivion. It felt like a miracle, the kind Margaret Whitmore Hale had promised in the margins of her buried Bible. But miracles, Evelyn was about to learn, were often interrupted by new trials. It started with small things she tried to ignore. Luke's appetite vanished. The boy who had been so hungry for so long suddenly pushed away food. Dark circles appeared beneath his eyes. Bruises that wouldn't heal bloomed across his pale skin. He complained of leg pain that made him cry in the night, and his temperature spiked and fell with alarming unpredictability. "He's just tired from everything we've been through," Evelyn told herself. Told Noah when he expressed worry, told Iris when she asked why Luke wouldn't play anymore. But mothers know. Deep in that place where instinct lives sharper than reason, Evelyn knew something was terribly wrong. On a grey February morning, Luke collapsed. One moment he stood by the newly repaired window watching snow fall, the next he lay crumpled on the floor, his skin the colour of old paper, his breathing shallow and rapid. Evelyn's scream brought Noah running from outside, and together they wrapped Luke in blankets and carried him to their car. The drive to Charleston took 3 hours that felt like 3 lifetimes. Luke drifted in and out of consciousness in the back seat, cradled in Iris's lap, while she sang soft songs through her tears. Noah sat rigid in the passenger seat, his jaw clenched so tight Evelyn feared his teeth would crack, his hands gripping his thighs as if he could hold the family together through sheer force of will. The emergency room at Charleston Medical Center smelled of antiseptic and fear. Doctors moved with practiced urgency, asking questions Evelyn struggled to answer through her panic. They took Luke away on a gurney, his small hand reaching for her until distance broke their connection, and she stood in the sterile hallway, feeling more helpless than she had even in the worst moments at the cabin. The diagnosis came 6 hours later, delivered by a doctor whose kind eyes couldn't soften the brutality of the words: acute lymphoblastic leukemia, childhood cancer. The phrase struck Evelyn like a physical blow, buckling her knees so that Noah had to catch her. This boy becoming man holding up his mother because someone had to remain standing. "The treatment protocol is aggressive," the doctor explained, her voice gentle but unflinching. "Chemotherapy, possibly radiation, bone marrow testing. We need to start immediately. The good news, if there is good news, is that this type of leukemia has a high survival rate when caught early and treated properly." "How much?" Evelyn heard herself ask. "How much does treatment cost?" The number the doctor provided might as well have been $1 billion. Even with the donations, even with every penny they had, it wasn't close to enough. Insurance, what little Caleb's mining job had provided, had lapsed with his death. They were uninsured, impoverished, and facing a medical crisis that could drain every resource and still demand more. That night, while Luke slept in a hospital bed that made him look impossibly small, Evelyn called the number on Lucas Cole's card. He answered on the second ring, listened to her broken explanation, and responded with 2 words that changed everything. "I'm coming." Lucas arrived the next morning with his camera and a determination that burned like cold fire. He photographed Luke, with Evelyn's permission and with careful respect for the boy's dignity, capturing images that told the story without exploiting the subject. Luke with IV lines trailing from his small arms. Luke asleep, his bald head already showing where hair would soon fall from chemotherapy. Luke awake, trying to smile for the camera with courage that broke every heart that would later see those images. Lucas wrote again, this time with even greater urgency. He detailed Luke's diagnosis, the impossible costs, the cruel mathematics of American healthcare that made survival a luxury only some could afford. He published the story across every platform he could access, tagging journalists, advocates, and anyone with reach beyond his own. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The GoFundMe exploded, thousands of donations pouring in from across the country and beyond. $20 from a teacher in Ohio, $50 from a retired nurse in Oregon, $100 from a coal miner in Kentucky, who wrote simply, "For Caleb's boy." Local news stations picked up the story, then regional networks, then national morning shows. Within 72 hours, the donations exceeded $100,000. Within a week, they passed 200,000. People who would never meet Luke, who lived in worlds completely different from the one Evelyn inhabited, opened their wallets and their hearts, because suffering recognized across distance demanded response. And then came the letter. It arrived at the hospital addressed to Evelyn, postmarked from somewhere in New England with no return address. Inside, a single typed page. "I lost my daughter to leukemia 30 years ago. We had resources and still lost her. You should not lose your son because you lack what we had. All medical expenses will be covered through a private trust. Luke will receive the best care available. You focus on being his mother. I'll handle the rest. You don't need to know who I am. You just need to know you're not alone. A friend." Evelyn read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated. Someone, some anonymous person touched by grief and moved by empathy, was saving her son's life. The financial weight that had threatened to crush them lifted, as if it had never existed. Luke's treatment began immediately. Aggressive chemotherapy cycles that left him weak and nauseated, his small body racked by side effects that seemed worse than the disease itself. His hair fell out in soft clumps that Iris collected in a box, unable to let go of even these small pieces of her brother. His weight dropped until his bones showed sharp beneath translucent skin. But he fought. With the stubborn determination inherited from both his parents, Luke endured each treatment, each blood draw, each terrible day when the medicine felt like poison. Noah read to him for hours, adventure stories about boys who survived impossible odds. Iris drew pictures that covered the hospital walls, colorful fantasies of mountains and cabins and families whole and healthy. Evelyn never left his side, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, advocating fiercely with doctors and nurses, holding him through the worst moments when he begged for it to stop. Months passed in the strange timelessness of hospital existence. Spring arrived outside the windows, then summer, the world continuing while their universe contracted to the size of a single room. The donations continued to arrive, not just money now, but cards and letters and small gifts from strangers who had adopted Luke's fight as their own. And then, on an October morning, when autumn painted the mountains in colors Luke hadn't seen since before he got sick, his oncologist delivered words that felt impossible. He's in complete remission. The cancer is undetectable. Luke is going to be okay. Evelyn collapsed into Noah's arms, her body shaking with sobs that released 6 months of terror held at bay. Iris climbed onto Luke's bed and hugged him with desperate gentleness, afraid he might break but unable to not touch him. Luke, bald and thin but smiling with his father's smile, asked if they could finally go home. They could, But home held one final secret that would complete their journey from despair to redemption. They returned to the cabin in late October, when the mountains blazed with autumn fire and the air carried the promise of another harsh winter. But this time, they were prepared. The cabin stood solid and weatherproof, transformed by volunteer labor and collective compassion into something resembling a real home. Luke, still thin but growing stronger each day, ran ahead of his siblings to the door, eager to see the place that had nearly killed them and now offered shelter earned through suffering. Evelyn stood for a moment, taking it all in. The repaired roof, the sealed walls, the small generator that would provide electricity through the cold months ahead. They had survived. Against every odds stacked against them, they had survived. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by a courier who seemed uncomfortable with his task. Evelyn signed for the thick envelope with growing dread, recognizing the law firm's name embossed on the return address, the same attorneys who had represented Marcus and Stephen Whitmore. Inside, legal documents dense with terminology she struggled to parse, but certain phrases leaped out with vicious clarity. Unlawful occupation, property rights disputed, cease and desist. Eviction proceedings. The Whitmore brothers were taking back the cabin. Now that it had been repaired, now that it had value again, they wanted it returned. The cruelty was so pure it took her breath away. Noah read the documents over her shoulder, his face hardening with an anger that frightened her. They can't do this, not after everything. But they could. The paperwork laid it out with legal precision. The deed transfer had been improper. The property technically remained part of the Whitmore Estate Trust. Evelyn had no legal standing. They were giving her 30 days to vacate. That night, Evelyn pulled out Margaret Whitmore Hale's Bible, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. Somewhere in this story of a woman erased from family history, there had to be answers. She read through the inscriptions again, studied the dates, noticed for the first time small notations in the back pages she had overlooked before. There, in Margaret's careful script, a record. Cabin deeded to me by father, 1887, in settlement of disputes. Later hidden here when they tried to take it back. Property belongs to bloodline, to whoever needs it most, not to whoever grasps hardest. Truth buried with this book. Let it speak when needed. Evelyn's heart raced. A deed. Margaret had hidden proof of ownership with the Bible, and if that deed still held legal weight, she contacted Lucas immediately, and he arrived the next day with a lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in property rights and had offered her services pro bono after following Luke's story. Together they returned to the cabin and began excavating the spot where the Bible had been buried. It took hours of careful digging, but finally Sarah's trowel struck something solid. A metal box, sealed with wax, buried beneath where Margaret's Bible had rested for over a century. Inside, protected from moisture and time, lay documents that would change everything. The deed to the cabin property, signed in 1887, transferring ownership to Margaret Whitmore Hale. And beneath it, a handwritten will dated 1923, written in Margaret's weakening hand. Being of sound mind but failing body, I leave this property to whichever of my descendants finds themselves most in need, most cast out, most forgotten by the Whitmore name. This cabin saved my life when my family abandoned me. Let it save another. Let the desperate find shelter. Let the broken find hope. And let the Whitmore family know that charity denied on earth will be accounted for in heaven. Margaret Whitmore Hale, April 14, 1923. Sarah Chen photographed every document, her expression fierce with professional satisfaction. This changes everything. Margaret's will is legally binding, and her intent is crystal clear. The cabin belongs to the descendant in greatest need, and that's demonstrably you. The legal battle that followed was brief but intense. The Whitmore attorneys argued the documents were too old, improperly filed, superseded by modern estate law. Sarah countered with historical precedent, with property records that confirmed Margaret's ownership, with the clear intent of a will that anticipated exactly this kind of family cruelty. Lucas documented everything, publishing updates that kept the public engaged and outraged on Evelyn's behalf. The pressure of national attention, combined with the legal strength of Margaret's will, proved overwhelming. 6 weeks after receiving the eviction notice, Evelyn received a different letter. This one from the Whitmore estate attorney, formally withdrawing all claims to the property and acknowledging her sole ownership. The cabin was hers. Legally, permanently, irrevocably hers. Before we conclude this incredible journey, we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. If Evelyn's story has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share this video. These stories of survival and redemption need to be heard, and your support makes that possible. We're so close to our goal. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can continue bringing you real stories of real people overcoming impossible odds. On the first anniversary of Caleb's death, Evelyn gathered her children in their rebuilt home. The wood stove radiated warmth, the generator hummed quietly, and the pantry held enough food for months, all gifts from strangers who had become guardian angels. Luke's hair had grown back in soft curls, and color had returned to his cheeks. Iris smiled more easily now, and Noah's shoulders had lost some of their terrible burden of premature responsibility. Evelyn placed Margaret's Bible in the center of their table, the metal box beside it, containing the documents that had secured their future. She told her children the complete story, not just of their own suffering and survival, but of Margaret's parallel journey a century before. 2 women, both abandoned by the same family, both saved by the same cabin, both leaving legacies that would echo across time. "We're not just survivors," Evelyn said, looking at each of her children in turn. "We're proof that cruelty doesn't have to win. That people, most people, are good when given the chance to be. That faith isn't about never doubting. It's about continuing even when doubt seems justified." Outside, the first snow of a new winter began to fall, but inside they were warm and safe and together. The cabin that had been meant as an insult, as a final act of family cruelty, had become instead a testament to resilience and the power of collective compassion. Margaret Whitmore Hale's words had proven prophetic. This place was meant for new beginnings, not endings. And in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, in a cabin rebuilt by strangers and sanctified by suffering overcome, the Whitmore family began again, not as victims of circumstance, but as architects of their own survival, supported by a nation of people who had proven that solidarity was stronger than any system designed to crush the vulnerable. The Bible remained on their table, a reminder of where they had been and what they had endured. But when Evelyn looked at her children, healthy, fed, safe, and loved, she saw not the past, but the future they had fought so hard to claim.